Thank you for joining me today, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present Rose-K to you and how to apply it in post-surgical cases. So what we'll look at today is the different Rose-K designs and look at different types of surgery and work out together what is the best way to tackle sometimes very, very difficult fittings. Just a reminder to those that use Rose-K designs, there are 5 actual rigid lens designs that are available. For those that use my designs, you'll be aware that for oval cones and nipple cones, your first indicated lens are corneal lenses. I still advocate that over a semi-scleral lens. So either the keratoconus lens for larger cones and the nipple cone lens for smaller cones. But once you get to these larger areas of distortion, these smaller lenses do not center, they're often not stable, and you need to go to either a bigger corneal lens like the post-graft design or the irregular cornea design, which covers most of the cornea. And if that fails, the corneal scleral lens design, which is a 14.6 semi-scleral lens. Although the semi-scleral lens first indications is for these larger areas of distortion, it can be used on cones as well. So you can use the XL design on any type of irregular cornea or post-surgical cases. But today's lecture is specifically related to the post-operative cases and mainly grafts, but we'll also touch on LASIK and some other types of surgery. So what types of surgery do we see that are common with corneal? Obviously the corneal grafts, and that can be full penetrating or it can be a partial penetrating graft, which only either takes out the upper layers of the stroma or in some cases just an endothelial graft. So I'll talk about grafts in general. The LASIK or PRK, very common where you get fascia. RK, fortunately in New Zealand, we didn't have many RK cases, so I've seen only a few of those. Corneal ring inserts, which are very common in some countries. And I'm also going to touch on these conditions, pterygium glaucoma, a shunt, because if you move the lens to bear outside the limbus, these things need to be considered as well. So we're going to start off with corneal grafts. And for those that fit grafts, there are some common factors. No two grafts are ever the same. So it's very hard to give you a definite way to fit grafts because they're often high degrees of astigmatism, which is often irregular. The graft size can be different. It can be big or small. Sometimes it's not located centrally. Sometimes it's oblate, so it's flat in the middle. Other times it's prolate, like a keratoconus. So until you actually put a lens on there or look at a topography, you really don't know what shape of cornea that you're fitting. The other things you should consider is the age and the type of the graft, because full thickness grafts are more at risk, and as they get older, more at risk from failing than partial thickness grafts. Also the condition of the endothelium, although most of us don't have the methods to be able to measure exactly the endothelial counts, once you start looking at endotheliums, you get a good idea of whether you have a healthy endothelium or whether you have an issue. And that's very, very important when you're thinking about the type of lens that you're going to put on this cornea. Also, do you have any vascularization up to the graft? Obviously, if you do not want to reduce oxygen. You want to maximize oxygen to the graft, or otherwise those vessels could penetrate into the graft and cause rejection. So particularly corneal lenses, a fit is often a compromise. It's very difficult to get a perfect fit, although I'll be showing you some pictures in a moment of some very good fits with a corneal lens on graft. Also to mention the studies, there's 3 studies were done many years ago now where patients were referred to specialists to have grafts done. The specialists in their wisdom said, no, I don't think these corneas need grafts. I'd like them to be fitted by an expert keratoconus fitter. They were referred back to these people that are mentioned here. And you can see that, in fact, 85% of the patients that were referred for grafts were able to be successfully fitted, 95% in some cases here, with 85% achieving very good vision. So grafts, in my opinion, are much more difficult to fit than a keratoconus. So try every option before you refer for a graft. And it's very interesting to see the graft numbers in the world going down. In New Zealand here, they're under 50% of what it was about 40 years ago. So we're continuing to see designs getting better, materials getting better, manufacturing getting better, and we're able to keep the majority of patients without needing a graft in their lifetime. Just touching, I mentioned on endothelium, and just to give us an idea, we actually born with 5,000 cells per square millimeter on average, but by age 40, that naturally drops to around 3,000. And what is the average endothelial count for what regard as a normal healthy cornea? It's between 2,000 and 3,200. So once you get below this, you are starting to consider that the endothelial count is abnormal. If we look at a penetrating graft, this was a study done back in 2019, last year, on penetrating grafts. And what they did is they looked at the endothelial count at baseline 10 days after surgery and found that it had a range of about 2,300 up to about 2,500. But after 5 years, that had dropped down to an average of around 1,035. So naturally, after the graft, in the first 5 years, the patient had lost 56% of their endothelial cells. Does it stop after 5 years? No, it doesn't. It actually continues to actually deteriorate. This is another study done up to 15 years. They looked up to 10 years here, and they found that there was a natural endothelial loss on grafts which continued, and this actually increased your rate of risk rejection, and graft failure occurred in about 21% of cases of graft over a 10-year period. This doesn't sound like much, 7.8% per year, but if you multiply that by 5, you've lost 40% of your endothelial cells in the first 5 years. So why I emphasize this, it's very, very important to look at the graft that you're fitting. Do you have vessels? Do you have a regularly normal endothelium? What is the shape of the graft? Before you put a lens on that, you should consider it. I see, as I travel around the world, so many fitters just say, I've got a graft, I'll stick a semi-scleral lens onto it without really looking at detail at what type of cornea they're fitting. So what are the options for grafts? Sometimes a regular silicone hydrogel, even daily lens, can give a very good result. So it's always worth thinking. Even if the graft shows a degree of astigmatism, sometimes you can get quite a good result and supply plenty of oxygen and get a successful result with a graft. Corneal lenses are my preferred option if you can fit them, simply because they put much less stress onto the graft. They're a proven modality. We know they work. They have very low infection rates, and they have high oxygen transmission and tear transmission. So they are still my preferred option if you can fit them. Piggyback contact lens system I'm going to touch on, where you put a soft lens under a rigid lens, and mini scleral lenses, which include corneal sclerals and sclerals. And for me, hybrids haven't been a great option. I have found they just don't supply enough oxygen to the graft. So I'm not even going to talk about hybrids with grafts today. So for those, again, that know my designs, there's the post-graft design, which is the first line of defense if you're going to fit a corneal lens on a graft. And it's specifically for post-graft cases, also for post-LASIK, also for post-corneal rings. Also has application for a large descented oval cone. So if the cone is descented well down, sometimes the smaller keratoconic lenses don't work. They center too far down. You need a bigger back optic area, which the post-graft lens has. So in some cases with large descented cones, oval cones, the post-graft also has application. The trial set is 22 lenses. You can't fit it empirically just off maps. You need to use a trial set with a standard diameter of 10.4, and you are offered a range of edge lifts, which I won't go into detail, just simply say, like all my designs, you can change the edge lift quite dramatically from increased where you make it more lift down to decreased where you control it and pull it down. So if we look at the design, it has reverse geometry, and particularly in flatter bases, anything flatter than about 7.2 has reverse geometry. And this increases as you get flatter and flatter with your K readings, which makes sense because if you try to fit a normal lens, like a keratoconic lens, on a cornea that's this shape, you end up with a large central pull over that oblate area. And so the only way to get around that is to apply what we call reverse geometry or reverse curves just outside the optic zone, which reduces the thickness of that tear layer. And the more oblate the cornea is, the more reverse geometry the post-graft design has in it. Typically, as grafts gets older, they tend to steepen, so it's something you need to watch closely and review them on regular occasions. And in my case, I like to see them at least every 6 months. The post-graft lens design has a tighter periphery than the keratoconus lens design, simply because we're dealing with a different profile of cornea. So again, for those that fit my designs, this is my fitting system, which I advocate. 5-step fitting system. We start with the central fit or the base curve. We move to the peripheral fit, the diameter, the location, and the lens movement. So let's start with the central fit. And I'm just going to show you quickly some fitting patterns. So these are the steps we're looking at. Now, this is an excellent fitting post-graft rose K lens on a surgical cornea, on a post-graft cornea. We don't have any high areas of touch, slight touch here and here, but that's not going to cause any problems. We have excellent edge lift. This is absolutely what I want, a nice fluorescent band at the edge of the lens. So on the blink, those tears would exchange very, very well. So that is an excellent corneal lens. That patient would do very well. How about this one? Again, we look at the things we should consider. What is wrong with this one? Is the base curve a little bit flat? It could be. It's got a little bit of excess touch here, although if we don't get staining, it doesn't really matter. We do have an excessive edge lift, and you can see the odd little bubble at the edge of the lens, suggesting that edge lift is too high. We need to close that down. The overall diameter is good. It locates well. So the main changes I would make there would be to reduce the edge lift result. What about this one? Looks like a little bit excessive touch here. The lens is not locating exactly centrally, but I know the patient was wearing this lens without any problems. There was no staining over this area. So I actually didn't change anything, even though it's not the perfect fit. The edge lift's a little bit excessive. The diameter looks fine. And if I steepen the central base curve to clear this, I'm going to increase the depth of tears here. So if I fix this, I'm going to make this worse. So I didn't bother to change it. The patient was happy. And one thing it did teach me is that in grafts, you are better to have excessive edge lift than a closed edge lift. That will cause you much, much more problem than an open edge lift like you see here. So I would have, in this case, if I was going to make a change, I would simply have ordered a decreased edge lift. Here is a toric cornea or toric graft. You can see the edge of the graft just here. So outside of the graft, we actually don't have any toricity. You can see here, there's no toric pattern showing outside that graft, but within the graft itself, you can see a very much a toric against the raw graft, where the lens is bearing vertically and is quite open in the horizontal meridian. Again, this patient was wearing this lens quite happily. How would you improve that? Pretty hard to improve without making it quite a complicated lens, where over the central optic zone you had toricity, and outside of that you simply had a sphere. I don't, unfortunately, offer that design in Rose K. What about the IC lens? The IC is again a corneal lens, and it's made for the irregular cornea. and it occupies the majority of the cornea. So when I designed this back in 2000, it was basically for early pellucid. We weren't using these larger lenses like semisclerals. I now prefer semisclerals for pellucid. Early globus and for some laser-induced cases, and also for grafts. So that's why I'm touching on it in the graft section. So the IC lens is slightly smaller trial set. The standard diameter is around 11.2. And again, you have a big range of base curves from as steep as 5.7 to as flat as 9.3. And you have quite a large range of edge lifts. You can get all that information from your distributor or your lab. So here's an IC lens on a graft. You can see the edge of the graft here. What is the main problem with this fit? The main problem is here. This is not too bad. We have feather touch, and you can see in the periphery it's too tight. We need to open that up. That will make the lens move more. It will make the lens sit higher. This has got inferior location as well. So by loosening up the periphery, we'll improve the location and will improve the tear flow underneath the lens. Here's another IC lens, and you can see it occupies the majority of the cornea, but we have quite a big open edge lift here, and also we're slightly flat over that high area along the edge of the graft. So very commonly the highest point in the cornea is on that graft host interface, somewhere around the edge of the graft. So that is causing the lens to lift off inferiorly here. So this would not be successful. What we want to do, we'd want to steepen up that base. When you steepen up rose K lenses, the peripheral fit will also tighten. So you can't look at this and say, okay, I'm just going to go 0.2 steeper with my base curve, and I'm going to go to a decreased lift here, because once you go 0.2 steeper or 0.3 steeper as is required here, your edge lift might be absolutely perfect. So you have to consider the base curve first, get that correct, and then have another look at what's happening in the periphery of the lens. However, if it is excessive still like this, you would need to order a decreased lift. This patient, again, was wearing this lens quite successfully. It's not an ideal fit, and very rarely, as I mentioned, do you get an ideal fit on a graft. If you look here, it's very tight along the limbus here. It's open here. It's not too bad in these areas here. We don't have any significant staining over this part of the graft, so I didn't actually make any changes there. Is the base curve flat? If I started to see staining here, I would increase the base curve and make it a little bit steeper. How am I going to deal with the edge lift? I do offer what's called quadrant-specific edge lift options in all of my designs, including the XL or the semi-scleral design. What are quadrant-specific edge lifts? It's where you say, I want to increase my edge lift, say, in this quadrant, I want to decrease in this quadrant, and I want to increase it in another quadrant. So in each of the 4 quadrants, 90 degrees, you can have a different edge lift. So one option here would be, I'm not too unhappy with this or this, but I would want to increase my edge lift in this quadrant here from 0 up to 90. Here's a Rose K2 IC lens on an oblique graft, and again, you can see how the lens doesn't center particularly well. If grafts are very toric, often they decenter as you see here. So again, what would you consider? A toric periphery where you, I'll just play that video again, where you actually alter the fit over the peripheral cornea here and here, or again, a quadrant-specific edge lift where you want to increase the edge lift here, and certainly you want to decrease it in this quadrant. Here's an IC on a post graft. You can see the edge of the graft here. It's had a relaxing incision cut subsequent to the graft. What are the main problems here? The base curve is too steep. We're not seeing, we can go definitely flatter than we've got here. The periphery is too tight. I don't have that nice fluorescent band at the edge of the lens. The diameter looks probably okay, and the location's a little bit inferior, but certainly by increasing the edge lift, I will improve the location of that lens. This was an interesting case, was presented to me by a New Zealand practitioner where they tried to fit IC directly onto the cornea. It mislocated and they got bubbles underneath the lens. You can see the lens mislocating onto the sclera here. This was the fluorescent picture. The lens looks a little bit flat here. It's bubbling and it's certainly pushing out into the temporal portion. So what this practitioner did was use a +1 Premio lens and piggybacked the IC lens over it, and immediately he got much better centration and the patient's wearing time was improved and the fitting pattern was markedly improved. So a very good result simply using a piggyback plus IC lens piggybacked over a soft lens. This was a case that I'm worth touching on, and it did teach me a lesson, which I'll put at the end. You can see here, this is a graft, a high degree of astigmatism. It's got 13 dots of astigmatism across the graft. Initially, I fitted it with a toric back surface and a toric front, but the lens always tended to mislocate, and this gave limited wearing time and at times caused problems with the vision. So I wondered if I could help it. This patient had limited wearing time. So what I did was used a +350 oasis to create a new shape centrally, and I piggybacked an IC lens over that top of that. So if you look here, with this is the original lens I fitted, a toric back surface, which is mislocating. Here is a toric periphery lens, Rose K, over a +350 oasis. And although we still have some pooling centrally, I have got much better centration than I had before. So my lessons were full back surface torics do not center well on toric grafts. So typically fitting a back surface toric corneal lens on a graft is not successful. Toric periphery lenses, however, are more successful on toric grafts than full back surface. And just think, sometimes using a plus-powered soft lens can help center the lens better. However, there are certain cases, no matter what you do with a corneal lens, you can't get a good fit. And here, these cases, which that's going to be most unsatisfactory, that lens is decentering well out. And again, we have a high degree of astigmatism across the graft. And sometimes, even if you get a good fit, central position, this is a post-graft Rose K, patient looks sideways and the lens dislocates. So stability can certainly be a problem with some post-graft fittings. Also, in some cases, because of the lid position, where you have a very low bottom lid, you can have difficulty getting a corneal lens to locate, and simply going to a larger lens like XL, you can immediately improve that centration, as you see here. Just so we're all on the same page, so you know what I'm talking about when I talk about XL. XL is a corneal scleral lens, so it has a shared bearing on the cornea and the sclera, but it has most of its bearing just inside the limbus on the cornea. Scleral lenses completely vault the cornea, so you don't touch the cornea, and they have all their bearing completely outside the limbus on the actual sclera. And you can see here from this diagram, this is an XL, this is my design here, it's a very thin lens. Here's the limbus. So we actually land the lens just inside the limbus, and then we open up the periphery to ensure we get good tear exchange right up to the limbus to oxygenate those limbal stem cells. And you can see here's your typical pattern with the landing zone just inside the limbus. Whereas with a scleral lens, you actually vault outside the limbus, so some of the conjunctiva is actually trapped underneath the lens. So here's my philosophy for fitting. You basically have 30 to 50 microns clearance at the highest point. So if it was a cone, it would be the apex of the cone. If it's a graft, it's usually somewhere along the graft interface. You have 20 to 30 microns clearance over the limbus, and that may look, because there's not sufficient depth of fluorescent, like it's touching, but we talk about a feather touch. And then you span out to the edge of the lens with enough edge lift to ensure that you have good tear exchange up to the limbus. I again advocate the 5-step fitting system as you see here. So let's start with that central fit. For XL, you do have a fitting guide based on the mean Ks as you see here. So if you go to your fitting guide and we look at any of these conditions like post-graft, so I'll just go back there. Your first indicated trial lens for post-graft would be 0.6 steeper than the mean Ks. So you choose your lens based on the condition guide, you fill it with non-preserved saline, add plenty of fluorescent, don't be afraid to put plenty of fluorescent in, and select the flattest base curve that shows no touch at the highest point on the cornea. So you can keep going flatter until you see that first amount of touch over the highest point of the cornea, then you know you're too flat, you've got to go back 0.1 steeper than that. You can judge the fit immediately, put the lens in. There's very little settling time, but do remember, it's in the fitting guide, you're now choosing the flattest base curve, which shows no touch. I used to talk about feather touch, but unfortunately, practitioners' interpretation of feather touch was quite different, and sometimes feather touch was very heavy touch. So I now talk about the flattest base curve, which shows no touch. So once you get the correct base curve, you're allowed to settle for further 20 minutes and reassess it. It can settle down a little bit, 20 to 30 microns in some cases, but in other cases it doesn't settle any further. If you need to add fluorescent, put it on the sclera, a couple of blinks, and that will flush underneath the lens. Again, it's imperative to not leave the lens flat. If it does, you can cause problems to the cornea. So here's a graft. You can see the edge of the graft here, and this is clearing the edge of that graft. This is the highest point by somewhere between 30 to 50 microns. So once you've got 30 to 50 microns here, you won't see any touch over that area. And if you have an OCT, you can verify that over the highest point. The minimum tear layer I want is 30 microns. The maximum I want is 50 microns. This is flat, that's going to cause staining on this graft here and here. And again, this is flat, this will cause staining and problems and lack of movement. It's also interesting that even though this lens is flat, it's actually bound to the cornea. So when you fit a corneal lens flat, it tends to move more. When you fit XL flat, it tends to move less and bind. So this is significantly flat, probably at least 0.4 too flat here. So this is slightly flat. You can see over the edge of the graft here, we are slightly flat. And again here, I don't really want to see any feather touch at all. I want to see that cleared. And once again, with grafts, the most common place you have to judge the base curve is along the edge of the graft, not centrally. We completely forget about what's happening to our central fit here. We only judge what's happening along the edge of the graft. And this is now moving to the edge lift. What I'm trying to establish is a nice edge lift that shows nice fluorescence underneath the edge of the lens. This is too tight, that's getting too open, and that is absolutely ideal. And you have a range of 13 different edge lift options to change the fit outside the limbus by simply changing edge lift value. Another useful point with edge lift when you're assessing it is to see how easily tears are induced underneath the edge of the lens. So you simply put fluorescent on the conjunctiva, bring the lid up with the tear meniscus. When it touches the bottom of the lens, you should see the tears flush easily underneath. This will ensure they're getting tear exchange and that your edge lift's not too tight. If your diameter is too small with XL, it will cause bubbles because when the patient blinks, the edge of the lens moves up to the limbus and allows bubbles to come in. So if you're getting bubbles like this after you insert the lens, invariably either your edge lift is too high at some point around the clock, or alternatively, your diameter is too small. So let's now move away from corneal grafts and touch on corneal ring inserts. Not a lot of these have been done in New Zealand, but I know in some countries like Spain, there were many fitted. And this is a map which typically shows the highest point of the cornea is over the insert, directly over the insert. So here is a corneal lens fitted, rose-colored post-graft lens fitted on an insert. The patient got excellent vision, excellent result, a very good result. We have a lovely edge lift here. Is that flat? Pretty hard to judge, but it looks like there is fluorescence here. You don't want to see bearing over their area, otherwise you'll get staining. But overall, that's an excellent fit over that single ring. So with rings, again, there is a specific guide, the same as the Curex guide. So if your mean K of your cornea was 6.6, your first indicated lens for the guide for XL would be a 7.0 base curve. And this guide also applies for keratoconus. Let's look at some fitting patterns. This is definitely flat. That would cause binding to the cornea and cause significant staining, both centrally here and over the rings. This is not too bad, but we've still got a slight touch over the ring position here. I would want to go 0.1 steeper than that. Again here, slightly flat on the base curve, but the biggest problem here is that edge lift is too tight. That lens is probably going to bind. We're not going to get tear exchange underneath that lens. So my ordered lens would be a little bit steeper, and I would increase the lift by 1.5 or plus 1.5 to maximize that tear exchange. What about LASIK and PRK? When we get ectasia, we sometimes need to fit a corneal or a semi-scleral lens. This is the typical map you see with LASIK, where you have a very, very flat area over a small central area. And when you try to fit it with a lens, even though you are bearing quite heavily in this area, you get a lot of pooling and often you get bubbling, which is hard to get rid of. So using a high plus disposable lens to fill up that gap that we've got under the lens is quite useful. And the next picture I'm going to show you is this one here with a high plus lens and how it changes the fluorescent picture. So same eye, all I've done is used a high +5 lens, and you can see immediately how it's dramatically changed that central fitting pattern. So if you really get stuck and you want to use a corneal lens and you've got a very oblate cornea, certainly using a piggyback system can be useful. Here's another piggyback, one that I could not get good acuity with, no matter whether I fitted a corneal lens or I fitted XL. I was getting this pooling centrally, and my best vision was 6/18. So I thought, what if I used a high plus lens to fill this out and get more contact with the cornea? Will I be successful? And so I used a +6 soft lens, and you can now see the soft lens actually is touching the back of the lens here, and my acuity improved up to 6.9. So it was the only way with this case that I can improve the acuity. So here's a post-LASIK case with ectasia, and you can see as the patient's blinking, we're getting light touch. I'm very happy with that fit. As long as I see that the touch is not there all the time, I'm very happy. I'm very happy with that fit. Here's a post-LASIK ectasia that's a little bit too flat. I would want to increase and steepen that base curve a little bit, and also loosen up the periphery with a +1 edge lift. It's interesting to note what happens when you steepen the base curve with XL. This is on a post-LASIK case again. So this is a 7.0 base, and you can see here we've got a pooling here, and we've got a lot of touch, a very wide bearing area. Just steepening it by 0.1, we've reduced that bearing area, going to 6.8. I'm now seeing a bearing zone which is right. This lens would bind, so if you left that with XL, that lens would bind to the cornea, whereas this is the correct amount of zone of bearing, and this is a 6.8 base curve. This would be a very good result. And going any steeper really didn't improve our pattern at all. So finally, for the corneal conditions, RK, fortunately in New Zealand, very rare, and it's not done now. So most cases are quite old, but it can pose problems. And trying to fit a corneal lens on it, you can see here, this is an RK case with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 7 cuts in the cornea. We've still got a large ectasia area here, which is flat. The space curve is flat. Periphery looks good, but we've got the lens bearing over these scars. So typically corneal lenses don't do so well on RK. In my opinion, my preferred option is to go to a scleral lens, which completely vaults the cornea and doesn't touch any of these areas at all. So be very careful with RK that you don't get vessels growing in along the line of the suture of the actual scar. I want to finish off this presentation with talking about surgery outside, and I'm going to talk about the glaucoma shunt patient, where this patient had a glaucoma but wanted to be fitted with a scleral lens. So the case history, 53-year-old male, 3rd corneal graft in this eye that I'm trying to fit, and blind in the other eye after 5 grafts rejected, has a glaucoma shunt in this eye, corneal lens could not be fitted, and wants to be fitted with a large lens in that left eye. But how could we fit a scleral lens without compromising the drainage from the bleb? So this is what happened. You can see here, there's the glaucoma shunt. The bleb is up here. Here is our bleb up here. So if you put XL onto this, immediately saw that it was bearing over that bleb area which was raised. That would definitely have reduced the drainage out of that bleb. So the practitioner who fitted this said to me, can I design a lens which has lift off in the area of the bleb and has different areas of lift around the clock? So that's what I did. I designed a lens that had extra lift in this area. It's called a segment-specific ACT lens. We put a large amount of lift here, and then we put other lifts around the clock, so you can have that. And immediately you can see with this, we've now released that pressure over the bleb. We've got good drainage here, and this patient now wears this lens 8 hours a day. He probably could wear it more, but the practitioner wants to be conservative. It's a graft. It's a graft that's failed before. We don't want to put any extra problems or deprivation of oxygen with this graft. The design does have some cutting limitations because you basically come along with your edge and you have to lift it very quickly over a small segment, but the laboratory can tell you if they can do what you want them to do. So that finishes my presentation for today. This is Coromandel Cove in New Zealand, where I have a beach house, a very beautiful part of the North Island. My sincere thanks again to allow me to present to you, also to Menacon for sponsoring my talks, and to all of you for attending today. I do hope that this gives you some insight as how to apply my designs to those sometimes very, very complicated post-surgery cases. Enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your Congress. Thank you very much.